Going back to fishing, there will be those that argue that actually, it was the previous government that sold fishermen down the river in the first place by allowing Europeans access to fishing grounds for as long as they did.
Well, it was 1973 that, if that's what you mean, when Edward Heath, basically under the advice of the Treasury, basically decided to trade away UK
continuing to fish after the Brexit agreement.
And so what we did was we came up with a transitional plan, and this was very hard fought, and step by step we were taking back control of our fisheries. And as I've just explained to you, under the plan this is why the EU was so panic-stricken. That's why they wanted this so-called reset, because they knew that from January next year, every halibut, every cod, every mackerel in our waters was going to revert completely to UK control. And the disaster is that Starmer, the Labour Prime Minister, has thrown away that massive negotiating advantage for absolutely nothing in return. And I think it's a completely the wrong thing for UK fisheries.
But critics will argue that it was a poor and a weak deal in the first place. The first Brexit deal that has allowed this to happen.
No, that's rubbish. I don't know who these critics are, but they're talking total rubbish. Because actually, the deal that we did, as I have said, I think, and I'm saying that for the third time, allowed us to take back control of our fisheries in their entirety from next year.
In yet another desperate bid to rewrite history and perhaps secure his dwindling legacy, Boris Johnson has re-entered the political arena with a peculiar claim: that it wasn't his Brexit deal, nor the years of chaos his leadership ushered in, but rather Edward Heath's 1973 entry into the European Economic Community that doomed Britain from the start. The former Prime Minister, who now spends more time in speaking circuits and newspaper columns than governing, made the eyebrow-raising remark during a recent public appearance. With his signature bluster and selective historical amnesia, Johnson argued that the original sin of Britain's relationship with Europe lies not with Leave campaign misdirections or his own oven-ready deal, but with Heath's supposed failure to negotiate better terms over 50 years ago. Johnson is not alone. A growing cadre of nostalgic Brexiters have recently emerged from the political wilderness, desperate to remain relevant in a post-Brexit reality that has not panned out as promised. Nigel Farage is testing the waters again. Suella Braverman flirts with populist posturing. And now Boris, ever the showman, returns with a mythology that recasts him not as the architect of post-Brexit dysfunction, but as a near savior whose mission was thwarted by bad luck, disloyalty, and, apparently, Edward Heath. Poll after poll shows growing buyer's remorse over Brexit. Even traditionally Eurosceptic voters now question whether the trade-offs were worth it. Businesses have quietly realigned supply chains with the continent. Young people overwhelmingly favor closer European ties. And while Boris Johnson plays revisionist in chief, most Britons have moved on, grappling with real economic hardships and a cost of living crisis that slogans can't fix. If Johnson's return to the stage teaches us anything, it's that political fantasy dies hard. But reality, as always, has a way of intruding. And in that reality, Boris Johnson was not a victim of Edward Heath's decisions. He was the architect of his own undoing. The deal he delivered was not months away from brilliance. It was, in fact, a final act of a long-running political con that's still costing the country dearly.
There was always going to be a deal. I knew there would be a deal. Here's how you know there's going to be a deal. Because normally when you have negotiations, you have two different sides and they might want the same thing, like say a trade deal, but they have different priorities, different aims. One wants this, one wants that, one's willing to give away this, one's willing to give away that. The difference with this negotiation, of course, is that both sides wanted exactly the same thing, which is to give up British sovereignty to Brussels. That is literally what the EU wants. That is literally what Keir Starmer wants. He is a Remainer, a Ramoner in chief. He spent 3 years after the Brexit referendum in 2016 trying to stop Brexit from happening, after he said that he would respect the outcome of the referendum. And then he campaigned desperately to stop it from happening, and then only gave up when basically Boris Johnson was winning, won his majority, and Brexit was going to get done. Now, we knew there was going to be a 5-year review of some of the terms of the deal, and yeah, you have to do a bit of give and a bit of take to get what you want. As far as we can tell, we've given up access to British fishing waters for 12 years. It's reciprocal, but we don't need access to their waters. They need access to ours. We're going to align on EU plant and animal health laws, even though our levels are actually higher than theirs. We're going to be subject to the European Court of Justice jurisdiction. This is basically an all other phrase for dynamic alignment, which means we're going to follow EU laws, which makes it virtually impossible to be able to do a deal ourselves, because if EU law changes, then we have to change our law. And how can we do that if we've got a trade deal with someone else? No confirmation yet of a youth mobility scheme, but also no confirmation of whether there'd be a cap on numbers, or the age at which people would be allowed to come to, or indeed how long they'd be allowed to stay. We're told there's a defence pact that has been struck, but we don't know exactly what the deal is on that and how much access we'll have to that 150 billion euro fund to rearm the Western European countries. We're going to be rejoining the Erasmus Plus student deal. Oh, yay. We're going to get a little bit more access for British artists touring Europe. Yay. And apparently we're going to get access to use e-gates when we travel to EU countries, which, by the way, all EU countries have been entitled to already, which is why sometimes you arrive at a country, you can use the e-gate, and sometimes you can't. And it's entirely up to them now. And even under this deal, it'll still be entirely up to those member states. So what on earth have we got back for basically surrendering yet another benefit of Brexit?
It was supposed to be one of Brexit's big wins. Take back control, they said, of borders, laws, and crucially, Britain's fishing waters. But this week, that promise was thrown back into the political deep end as Prime Minister Keir Starmer reportedly agreed to extend EU access to British fishing zones for up to 12 more years. A move that has sparked fury from Brexit supporters and reignited debate over whether the gains of Brexit are slowly being bargained away. At the front of this renewed backlash is broadcaster Julia Hartley, brewer who pulled no punches in branding Starmer Ramoner in chief and accusing him of betraying one of the most emotionally resonant elements of the Leave campaign, the romanticized idea of a sovereign Britain once again in charge of its waters and its destiny. The specifics of the fishing arrangement are still emerging, but according to insiders close to the EU-UK negotiations, Starmer's government is attempting to strike a broader reset in UK-EU relations. The fishing access concession is said to be a sweetener in larger talks covering trade, cooperation, and a potential youth mobility scheme that would allow for easier movement between the UK and EU for work and study. Fishing has always held symbolic weight, disproportionate to its contribution to the UK economy, less than 0.1% of GDP. It's never just been about cod and haddock. It's been about sovereignty, about flags fluttering on the masts of trawlers, about a maritime nation reclaiming its birthright. So when Keir Starmer, once a vocal Remain advocate, appears to hand back that control even temporarily, it doesn't just anger the fishing industry, it reignites the cultural fault lines of Brexit itself. What's becoming increasingly clear is that Starmer is trying to walk a razor-thin line between economic repair and political restraint. His government knows Brexit cannot be undone without a massive public mandate. And yet it also knows the damage, particularly to trade, must be quietly addressed if growth is ever to return. This week's fishing concession is emblematic of that strategy, softening Brexit's rougher edges without reopening the whole debate. But for many voters who believed in Brexit's promises, this feels like a stealth reversal. Polling suggests that public patience with Brexit's aftermath is waning. A majority now believe it has delivered fewer benefits than expected. In Leave voting coastal communities, like Grimsby, Brixham, and Fraserburgh. Disillusionment is setting in as promised boosts to the fishing sector fail to materialize. Julia Hartley, Brewer's comments tapped into that emotional undercurrent. By framing Starmer's move as a betrayal and a surrender, she's giving voice to the sentiment that Britain's Brexit dividend has been squandered, not just by Starmer, but by the entire political class that promised more than they could deliver.